The host of Joe's Great Books is Joe Sharkey. He teaches at the University of Washington, Tacoma, but is not speaking for or sponsored by the UW. No, he's not. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Joe's Great Books, where it's not just the juice that's worth the squeeze, it's the squeeze that's worth the squeeze. That's what you go to school for, Stanford Law. I'm dividing this episode up into two parts to see if that makes them more inviting. Some of my fans, okay, one of them, but okay, that's 20% of them, said seeing the counter for podcast number 1 read almost 3 hours was more intimidating than enticing. Well, if this podcast does any better, I'll either continue to break future podcasts into smaller parts or just put more kitchenware on my head. A few prefatory notes. First, an update on the tech. Still sucks. This episode has some particularly rough editing. Rough editing. But if you made it through podcast 1, you can handle this one. It's just that there are all sorts of odd sounds lurking underneath the elegant discourse. I tried to edit them out, but if you get bored, you can just try to listen for what sound to my ear like zoo animals, and sometimes zoo animals flushing toilets. But why not make it a teaching moment? Here's some tech tips you can learn by negative example as you watch this podcast. A. The point of having a boom for your microphone. Don't rest the arm against the table. Defeats the purpose. B. You must always be in control of your lighting and, for example, should never record in front of a window. Contrary to what round earthers will tell you, the sun moves. C. Always get a haircut. Otherwise, when you finally take off the pasta strainer, the audience will think of the first time they saw Kylo Ren without his helmet. But of course, everyone knows, you don't come to JGB for the production or the makeup. You come for the books. Second, apologies and emendations. Deepest apologies to Sir Gawain from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight for my slander in the 48th minute of the second part. I said you flinched twice, when in fact you flinched only once. As lines 2292 to 94 of Marie Boroff's beautiful translation have it, at the Green Knight's second feint with the axe you, quote, gave no ground nor glanced up aside, but stood still as a stone or else a stout stump that is held in hard earth by 100 roots. In other words, he became a tree or a cross, like the root of Christ, which is the subject for another podcast I'll try to do soon. One note I ought to have explained more is that the novel Don Quixote is picaresque. That is, it's a story about a pícaro, a character type from Spanish literature who has a series of adventures and gets into all kinds of trouble. The word translates as rogue or rascal. Twain fans might think Tom Sawyer. Don Quixote is himself a kind of pícaro, and the novel is to a degree picaresque, meaning the central character is the main thing that unites the series of episodes in the story. So if it feels as if we jump around back and forth, well, that's because we do, as Cervantes did. It all gives the novel a bit of the character of a sitcom, in which characters have a series of episodes, establish patterns, repeat them many times, and then, delightfully, break them. Last, if you're wondering about my odd, occasionally spastic arm movements. No, there's nothing seriously wrong with me, medically speaking. So you can choose from the following explanations. 1, at the same time I was recording the podcast, I was also coaching third base, trying to get the runner on first to steal second. Or, I'm just really fidgety. I kind of like it that the tech is messed up. Reminds me of South Park. For example, when Anthony suddenly snaps his way back to color with a big smile toward the end of the opening song, which you can watch in 15 seconds. All right, welcome to Joe's Great Books. Today, podcast number 2, Rationalization in Don Quixote, subtitled Helmets of Mambrino, Biatches.
Oh my god.
Welcome to JGB. I'm Joe Sharkey. This is Anthony Joe Sharkey, and this is Joe's Great Books, a podcast about the great books of Western literature for the common man, the ordinary guy, and the average Joe or Anthony Joe, hosted by two of them, us. So, today, excited to talk about the greatest of great books of all, Don Quixote, with my firstborn son, Anthony Jehoshaphat Sharkey. I want to give you a little bit of background about him so you know who you're dealing with. His first nickname was the Meatball, round, meaty, Italian, delicious, with the same body mass then as now, just stretched out with a rolling pin. You know, you were fat as a toddler, but you're thin now. So you were Sancho, and now you are Don Quixote.
It's a relief.
He is a longtime big brother, a soccer player, and also a writer. Off to college by the time the podcast airs, right, Butch? Off to the University of San Diego.
Something like that.
Going to get a lot of time studying down there, right? On the beach, 8 months a year.
Yeah.
We'll see when the grades come out. His favorite TV show, Breaking Bad. His favorite dad, me. His favorite parent, Mom. And since you brought that up, I have a bone to pick with you. I've been meaning to bring it up for a long time. Seems like the appropriate time now. You drew a picture once on a 3x5 card. See if I can pull that up for the audience. Never mind, we'll dub it in the B-roll later. But for those of you listening on audio, it's a pencil-drawn 3x5 card, and it's in landscape format, so long like this, and it's divided into like 3 sections. And in the middle, it's got the words "me," and it's got a little stick figure for Anthony. And then on the left side, the title is "Mom," and then at the bottom, it says "Ninja." And it's got a picture of a ninja with kind of a cool flowing scarf, all in black, dashing from rooftop to rooftop, bravely, romantically. In the third column, on the right side of the card, the title is Dad. And at the bottom, the occupation given is nurse. Now, I know that there are a lot of wonderful male nurses, but if you go up in between the name of my role in the family and my supposed occupation, there is a picture of the most effeminate-looking nurse that anybody has ever seen, and she's got on one of those nursing hats, looks like kind of like a modest nun hat, pointy, cupcake, and either the best or the worst part of it is that not only am I a nurse, but I am obviously a really, really bad nurse, because lying out on the ground next to me is a stick figure with a man with X's through his eyeballs, whom I obviously have killed through my lame nursing. So, first of all, how old were you when you drew that insulting picture of me?
Well, that was yesterday. I draw as I see.
It was obviously done by something like a 6-year-old, maybe a precocious 7-year-old. And so, I mean, what was your brat 6-year-old self thinking when you drew the picture of me as a really effeminate, incompetent, lethal nurse?
Well, again, I draw as I once saw. So, I'm like Cervantes. I'm very descriptive like that. Maybe if I offend someone, that's just
all right.
Okay.
You did. Another thing to know about Anthony Joe is that he is usually the video guy for these podcasts, meaning the last one we did, the first one. And since he's on screen today, we have a substitute, his younger brother, Soul Sharky. So, Soul, why don't you lean in and introduce yourself to the hordes that watch this show?
What's up, people?
Well done. Now Mom won't be as mad at me as she was last time.
Indeed.
All right. So, to Don Quixote. Now, what we're going to do is kind of introduce the novel in general, just so people know what we're dealing with. You probably already do, because it's one of those classics that is so classic, so important to Western culture, and even to global culture now, I suspect that you know about it even if you don't know about it, much less if you have read about it. So you may know about the adjective that comes from the title character's name, Quixote. The Brits must have introduced it because they pronounce it in the British way without trying to do the Spanish. Quixotic. If you look it up in the dictionary, Webster's will tell you that quixotic means foolishly impractical, especially in the pursuit of ideals, especially marked by lofty romantic ideals or extravagantly chivalric action. It's not bad. My far superior definition, one honed over the years with help from students in my classes, is, quote, the relentlessly loyal, self-destructive, self-creating pursuit of a noble impossibility. Or, definition B, the rational execution of an irrational premise following this absurd premise to its logical conclusion. With Don Quixote, we'll find out that absurd premise is, I am a knight, even though the era of knights has long passed. Now, you might also know the expression, tilting at windmills. That generally means trying to do something that you have no chance of achieving, either because you're stupid or because you're idealistic. Depends on the context. You probably also know about Don Quixote and his trusty sidekick, Sancho Panza, as something of an archetypal comic duo. Don't have time to talk much about Sancho or about the comedy for the sake of comedy in today's podcast, but I hope to come back and do at least 1, 2, 3 more podcasts on Don Quixote because, as I said, it's one of the greatest of great books. Also one of the most influential. There are many, many works that either just flat out imitate, that is, do their own version of Don Quixote, or are inspired by the novel. All kinds of music, a variety of operas, many movies, TV shows, cartoons, and, of course, all sorts of literature, including drama, lots of play versions of Don Quixote, but most notably fiction, especially the novel, the genre that Don Quixote is taken to have inaugurated, at least in its modern form, though the Brits would disagree and they would give it to some guy named Richardson. Here are some quotations about Don Quixote from the critics and the writers. Here's one from a guy named Lukács. Georg Lukács wrote a book called The Theory of the Novel. Pretty good as literary theory goes. He just called it the first great novel of world literature. Foucault, not my favorite, really bad literary theory, wrote The Order of Things, and in that he's called Don Quixote the first modern work of literature, end quote, altogether. So the first modern work of literature all told. I think I would give it to Hamlet, which was about 4 years earlier. Here's a quote from someone who wrote, approaches to teaching Cervantes' Don Quixote. Her name is Ruth El Safar. She says, Don Quixote contains within it the birth, flowering, and death of the novel it is reputed to have introduced into Western letters. That's really good. Don Quixote does seem to kind of inaugurate, to establish this genre, and then to jump to the end, and then come back to the beginning, all in one fell swoop in 2 parts. Not bad. Lionel Trilling, very reputed literary critic, says, quote, all prose fiction is a variation on the theme of Don Quixote, by which he means illusion versus reality. Robert Coover, an author, wrote in Prick Songs and Descants, quote, Cervantes' stories sallied forth against adolescent thought modes and exhausted art forms and returned home with new complexities. Very flowery, but also very true. Cervantes was reacting against the relatively unexciting, unmodern work of his day, and he pulled it off. Susan Sontag, noted theorist, wrote in the Boston Globe Books section back in 1986 that Don Quixote is, quote, the first and greatest epic about addiction, which I have to tell you, I find kind of dumb in the way the 20th century tends to be dumb, 20th century PhDs. She's insisting on interpreting it through a modern lens, a present lens, and reducing something great, Don Quixote, to something that is kind of ordinary and banal. Don Quixote is not some self-help book, and he is not addicted. He is more idealistic than that. Milan Kundera, the guy who wrote The Unbearable Lightness of Being, in a different book, The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, called it the first European novel, whose author taught us, quote, to comprehend the world as a question. Now that, I think, is beautiful, and it does really hit the spot. All of Don Quixote's quest, you could say, is a question. It's come from the same etymological root, as you probably knew. Now, finally, a scholar you may have heard of named Huckleberry Finn said in a novel of the same name, if I weren't so ignorant, but had read a book called Don Quixote. And that, I think, tells you all you need to know. If Huck Finn considers himself improperly educated because he hasn't read your novel, then you wrote a great novel. Now, as I've said, I would just call it the greatest of all great books. A title I may reuse, I reserve the right. But one of the things that I love about it is that I think it's a book written by a non-genius. No offense to Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, which is his full name. I think he was a non-genius or a not genius who tapped into genius. So it's a wonderful kind of like Ratatouille story, kind of like Shakespeare. He comes from Podunk Stratford, isn't educated in the way you expect him to be, and yet lightning strikes. And for Shakespeare, it struck and struck and struck his whole career. Cervantes wrote a bunch of other things, as I'll describe or list in a brief historical or biographical introduction. But he never really caught lightning in a bottle in the way that he did with Don Quixote. And I don't think he knew exactly what he was doing. Some podcast in the future will talk about art and about the way artists kind of transcend themselves. They're kind of swept on a wave into transcendence, into a better version of themselves or something that's not themselves at all. When they write their best, they are more artistic and smarter and more insightful and more important, holier, you could say, more sacred than they are when they're not being so swept up. And Milan Kundera, the guy I mentioned before, the guy who wrote Unbearable Lightness of Being, doesn't seem to be so much in vogue anymore, but I think he is a really, really impressive author, and just the way he writes is exquisite. He wrote a book called The Art of the Novel, which I will read a little bit from now. Basically, he said that this was, Don Quixote was the first book to declare, prepare yourself, that God was dead. It wasn't Nietzsche, it was Cervantes who didn't say that, but you could say implied that. Now, actually, I would disagree with Kundera on that to some degree, but the way he writes about it, I think, is very insightful, so I'll read from it. So this is from the first chapter of this book. The book is The Art of the Novel. I forget when it was published, 80s maybe? Let me check, 86, yes, first published in 86 in French. Kundera himself is Czech, but wrote in French. And the first chapter is called The Depreciated Legacy of Cervantes. So part 3 of chapter 1 reads, as God slowly departed from the seat whence he had directed the universe, in its order of values, distinguished good from evil, and endowed each thing with meaning, Don Quixote set forth from his house into a world he could no longer recognize. In the absence of the supreme judge, capital S, capital J, the world suddenly appeared in its fearsome ambiguity, the single divine truth, capital T, decomposed into myriad relative truths, parceled out by men. Thus was born the world of the modern era, and with it the novel, the image and model of that world. To take with Descartes the thinking self as the basis of everything. Descartes is the guy who said, I think, therefore I am. And thus to face the universe alone is to adopt an attitude that Hegel, German philosopher, was right to call heroic. To take with Cervantes the world as ambiguity, to be obliged to face not a single absolute truth, but a welter of contradictory truths, truths embodied in imaginary selves called characters. To have as one's only certainty the wisdom of uncertainty requires no less courage. Checking to see if we need to read the rest. I'll read a little bit more. What does Cervantes' great novel mean? Much has been written on the question. Some see it as a rationalist critique of Don Quixote's hazy idealism. Others see it as a celebration of that idealism. Both interpretations are mistaken because they both seek the novel's core, not an inquiry, but a moral position. Well said, Milan. The idea of the book as a question, the world as a question, and therefore a quest, I think is wonderful. So thank you to him. Incidentally, buy this book. Still available, I'm sure, on Amazon and everywhere else. Great chapter on Kafka called Somewhere Behind. Eventually I'll get to a podcast or 10 on Kafka, one of my favorite authors, even though he's depressing and creepy and torturous, but, all in a good way.
Yeah.
I'll do a podcast on him, and I'm sure I'll come back to Kundera then. Now what I want to do is introduce Cervantes and give a brief biography. I'm going to sip now. If you have anything to say, now's the time.
When can I take this helmet off?
I was trying to slurp you out, but I was late. You can take it off whenever you like, but I do think that it would, if you were a man, you would leave it on. If you were a ninja instead of a nurse, you would leave it on until we get to the Helmets of Mambrino episode.
This was all set up.
It was absolutely.
You've been waiting years.
I was waiting for years, ever since you wrote that.
I can respect that.
Drew that little doodle.
It's a cold dish, but I'll take it, I guess.
Bihach. Okay. So Cervantes, Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, with the patronym and the matronym, born in 1547 near Madrid, I think in a town called Alcalá de Henares. He was minor gentry, so his fortunes had declined in a way not unlike what we'll find is true of Don Quixote. His father was a barber surgeon, which is fun because there are two prominent barber characters in Don Quixote. One something of an ally, one something of an antagonist. Little was known of Cervantes' childhood or early education, one of many parallels with Shakespeare. He seems not to have gone to a university, another was Shakespeare. I should point out that if you're wondering about Shakespeare, he was born in 1564, died in 1616, same year as Cervantes. So Cervantes, after his education, whatever it was, he enlisted in the Spanish fleet, and he fought at a battle between allied forces of Christendom and Turks, that is the Ottoman Empire, at Lepanto, that's in Greece and the Gulf of Corinth. This was in 1571, so he was a young man, 24, I believe. Independent accounts agree that despite a fever, he refused to stay below where it was safe and fought courageously. He was actually shot 3 times, and his left hand was left disabled for life. As he put it, for the greater glory of the right. After further military action, in 1575, he and his brother were attempting to return to Spain when they were captured by Barbary pirates. Have you ever heard of Barbary pirates?
Haven't actually. Rings a bell.
This is back in, as you could tell from the description of Lepanto, and the era in which Christendom was at war with the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. So it was Christian versus Muslim. Inhabited a variety of different places in northern Africa and maybe especially Algeria, but that's where Cervantes and his brother were captured and taken. They would take Christians hostage, hold them kidnapped, and hold them for ransom, use them for slaves. And in fact, at the Battle of Lepanto, I don't know what the correct numbers are, but I think it was 12,000, maybe 15,000 Christian slaves were freed in that expedition. And the sources I looked at say that it was the turning point of the struggle between Christians and the Ottoman Empire, and others say it really didn't matter because they just rebuilt their navy really quick. So maybe some historian can enlighten me about the truth. In any case, he was imprisoned there for 5 years, and apparently won the admiration of his captors by trying to escape, apparently several times, maybe 4. And there are apparently independent accounts that corroborate this. And apparently his leaders were charmed by his audacity and his bravery. But he happened to be carrying some letters with him that commended him for his proud military service, won by the leader of that Battle of Lepanto, Don John of Austria. Remember, it was Allied forces, so not just Spanish. And because he had that letter, his captors thought that he must be worth more. So they kept him and held out for a higher price. So eventually, and I should point out that in Don Quixote, Cervantes himself makes a brief cameo. There's a chapter, chapter 4, I think it's 39 to 40, where he tells about this happened upon this book, and they read it. It's called The Captive's Tale. In the middle of the story, the captive mentions some brave character whom even the captors went easy on because he was so bold. In fact, I say I have the quotation here, so I'll just read it. It says, "It was something de Saavedra. He was the only one that fared well with the captor was a certain Spanish soldier, something de Saavedra, to whom he never gave a blow himself, or ordered a blow to be given, or addressed a hard word, although he had done things that will dwell in the memory of people there for many a year, and all to recover his liberty." So you have to love it. It's like in the Odyssey when Homer praises bards, that is, minstrels or poets like him. Here's Cervantes takes it a step further and doesn't just praise his occupation, praises his own damned self, and does it by name. So eventually Cervantes was ransomed in 1580, supposedly for 500 gold escudos. Apparently, just before his captor was about to set sail back to Turkey and take all of his prisoners with him, which means we may never have seen Cervantes again, and therefore never Don Quixote. But apparently his family, maybe with some help from Trinitarian monks, came up with the dough and freed him. So he went back to Spain. He thought he was going to make a killing by some lucrative job because of his military pedigree. And it turns out that he was disappointed. He was constantly short for the rest of his life, not that much unlike Don Quixote himself, where he comes back a war hero and he expects people to care, and they just don't care in the same way that people just don't care about Don Quixote's chosen profession, which is knight errantry. We will get to that later. So it'd be 25 years after that return that he had a success with Don Quixote. And even then, he had sold the rights to the book, so that even though it was an immediate success, he didn't earn much at all. It was just like the initial bonus that they gave him. So he tried to get a variety of jobs. He wanted to go to the Spanish-American Empire, was not hired, turned to literature. And this is at the dawn of the golden age of Spanish theater, dominated by Lope de Vega, who kind of revolutionized it. And Cervantes thought that that's where he would make his name. So he later claimed to have written 20 to 30 plays, although only 2 survive. And this was the genre in which he thought that he would find literary glory. But he wasn't successful, even though some people think that his plays have some strong points. In 1585, he published another book called The Galatea. It's a pastoral romance, which at the time was a new kind of fashionable genre. And he talked about writing a sequel over the years, but one never came. He had a daughter out of wedlock. His only child, Isabel, was an affair with a married woman. He later married a woman who was 18 years his junior and stayed with her until his death. In 1587, when his literary career, that is his career in drama, wasn't enough to make him money to live on, he got a job requisitioning supplies, apparently getting corn and oil out of rural areas. Not all that obliged to give it, all for the Spanish Armada. He ended up in prison for what most sources call irregularities in his records. And the very next year, in 1588, the Spanish Armada was defeated by the English. I think it would be fair to blame Cervantes entirely for that, but it's kind of funny. He also got a job shortly thereafter as a tax collector. Some sources think he was fired. What we are more confident of, this is into the 90s now, 1597 to 98, that his discrepancies in his accounts as a tax collector landed him in prison in Seville. It is rumored and hinted in the prologue to Don Quixote that that's where he conceived the story, Don Quixote. Right, so that's apparently the place to go Anthony, if you want to be visited by the muse, you get locked up, right? All sorts of famous books that were written when somebody was in prison. We'll bail you out. So he finally wrote Don Quixote, part 1 in 1604, sold it, published it in 1605. It was an immediate success. And I see different details about this, but one source says that there were 2 pirated editions within the first month of the publication. There were all sorts of editions published, and I think these were legitimate ones owned by the publishing house in a variety of different places just within the first couple of months. I think there was an English translation within something like 7 years. And there was a play, I think in 1612. He seems to have collaborated with John Fletcher, who you might know as a guy who collaborated with Shakespeare. Anyway, haven't read it. I should read it because the title is called The Knight of the Burning Pestle.
Ooh, well, what the?
I wonder what that's that's an entendre for.
What's a pestle? I would like to know what a pestle is.
Mortar, pestle. Burning
Noted.
pestle. Enough said. He tried to get published, or he tried to get funded by various patrons. The variety of dedications at the beginning of Don Quixote Part 1 and Part 2, we all skip through them, and these prefatory sonnets, we're not going to deal with them. They're generally not that interesting. But he's trying to, essentially suck up to rich nobility so they will fund him. He had a mixed record with that. So 10 years after he'd first written Don Quixote Part 1, some guy that nobody knows, we still don't know who he is, one of the great mysteries of literary history, but the name attributed to a particular book was Alonso Fernandez de Avellaneda. What was this book? It was Part 2 of Don Quixote. It was a spurious continuation. It was not Cervantes himself. It was somebody trying to cash in on Cervantes' good name. So Cervantes immediately replies. He finishes his own Part 2 in 1614, publishes it in 1615, and we won't have time to talk about that today, but believe me, we will get into that, especially when, I think it'll probably be the second podcast when we talk about the relationship between language and truth, in history and fiction, 2 of the main dichotomies in Don Quixote. But the fun is that in Part 2 of Don Quixote and Sancho run into characters who have read Avellaneda's Don Quixote, and then they talk about it, cut it apart, and all agree that Cervantes' work is much, much better.
Yeah.
Very fun. So he died in 1616 on April 23rd, the very day, and in fact, it is said, rumor has it, the same instant as Shakespeare. They breathed their last breath in perfect synchronicity because they are 2 of my favorite authors.
How do you think they died? I think it went down like a joust or something like that. They had their lances, Cervantes on, his mock Rocinante, Shakespeare on his whatever, Hamlet, I don't know, Hamlet the horse. I can't think of Double Trouble.
Exactly.
And they're both going at it, and it's a tie. They both fatality.
Like his reached Cervantes' heart, and yours reached my heart, right?
Yeah.
And,
boom.
Right. And what we do know for sure is that they had a wonderful conversation as they ascended to heaven. Now, some spoil sports sources insist that Cervantes actually died on April 22nd, but why ruin a good story? So, as I said, Don Quixote was immediately successful and has been widely imitated and very influential ever since then. It was more popular to begin with than it was reputed in the literary sense, but it has only grown in its literary reputation as time has gone on because, as I hope you'll see as we talk about the book momentarily, it has depths. At the surface level, it just seems to be this really, really fun story. But you start to think about it, and you just go down and down and down and down until it seems like one of the most philosophically profound books in history, even though it's a novel that is substantially based on slapstick. So today we'll read extended passages from the book. That's fun. And we're going to do it with a book that's in the public domain. Now, this is not the one that's in the public domain. This is J.M. Cohen's translation. I forget when that was published, but I've used that for years. But this is not in the public domain, so sorry. Penguin. I'm not going to step on your toes. We're going to read one that is available in the public domain from Project Gutenberg. If you would like to take a look there, it's a wonderful site of public domain ebooks of all sorts. And many of the translations are wonderful. Some are a little dated, like Ormsby's is. His goes back to 1885. So some of the language is archaic, but I think a lot of it is archaic because Don Quixote is speaking, and he is speaking deliberately in kind of highfalutin language. Now, I said before I plan to have more than one podcast about Don Quixote. So how did I divide it up? Well, what I did is I noticed over the years that as I taught it, that there were certain oppositions in the book, certain dichotomies. And part of the genius of the book is the way it constantly pits them against each other, right? There's a tug of war, there's clangs or clashes, headbuttings between the two poles of these oppositions. So the key oppositions that I've identified over the years are sanity versus insanity, history versus fiction, the real versus the ideal, a similar one, truth, lowercase t, versus truth, uppercase T, capital T, and the most profound of them all, skinny versus fat, and of course the worldview that attends each. But none of those is the one that we're going to focus on today. The one we're going to focus on today, as I said in the title, is reason versus rationalization. Now, one of the recurrent joys of the novel, joys and jokes, is that it establishes these oppositions, but they don't stay put. Just when you're sure that all they're going to do is to butt heads, they switch positions. Sometimes they butt heads, and then pretty soon they kind of bleed together, and pretty soon they muddle. And you're not sure how to extricate them. You're not sure what's rational, what's irrational, what's reason, and what's rationalization. So instead of saying that these oppositions are always this versus that, it's often this and that, or this with that. We should probably start off with just the barest summary of the story. Now, I should ask you, I know you've read some of Don Quixote. I don't know how much you've read. What, if you were to describe the book to somebody who had not read it at all, although almost everybody's heard of him, how would you describe it in just, a couple sentences?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you already touched on it a little bit. I mean, it feels like a book that whether you've heard of the name Don Quixote, you've read it in some way, shape, or form. You see it across literature, but also pop culture. Like the skinny and the fat guy. But yeah. I guess if I had to, there's a really good quote that I like, and I guess I'm going to bring it up now, even though I was saving it for later. Is there's this part where Sancho is like laughing at Don Quixote, and that does all sorts of no good to his pride. And he says something like, Sancho, we live in an iron age, and I am standing up for the golden age. Something like that. Yeah. That's a great line to me. So I guess Perfect. Not my words, but, I'll let Saavedra do his thing.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And we're on our way to the quotation about the golden age, because that's part of it. So, and you went deeper, and I was just looking for like what's the the simple part of the plot. So, the plot I was looking for is just, well, we'll get to it. Okay. Let's read from Ormsby's translation. But the premise I can give you is that a man resolves to become a knight centuries after knights had ceased to exist. Here it is in chapter 1. This guy reads nothing but chivalries. And if you don't know what a chivalry is, actually you do. It's stories like the one about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Right? So any stories about knights jousting, fighting with swords, fighting mythological creatures like giants or dragons, coming back to report it to their lady and saying, look at what I've done for you, my love. And the woman looks at the beheaded dragon and says, it's not very big. And so he has to go out and do it again. You're probably familiar with the love triangle between King Arthur and Lancelot and Guinevere. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about romances or chivalric romances or works of chivalry. Don Quixote, it says, quote, he became so absorbed in his reading, in his books, that he spent his nights from sunset to sunrise and his days from dawn to dark poring over them. So if you didn't follow that, it's from sunset to sunrise, and then from dawn to dark, which is the same thing as from sunrise to sunset. So the idea, he's reading 24 hours a day. And what with little sleep and much reading, his brains got so dry that he lost his wits. To just read one more sentence, his fancy grew full of what he used to read about in his books: enchantments, quarrels, battles, challenges, wounds, wooings, loves, agonies, and all sorts of impossible nonsense. And it so possessed his mind that the whole fabric of invention and fancy he read of was true, that to him no history in the world had more reality in it. This is, I wish I could get mine to go back and forth. This is what I was talking about before with that opposition between history and fiction. Won't talk about it too much today, not the opposition for this podcast, but Cervantes, or at least the narrator, presents the whole story to you as if it is a history. And this actually has precedent in works of chivalric romance, where apparently just to convince people that the story was real or worth attending, they would claim that it was a history and then plunge into the most impossible nonsense, as Ormsby translates it, that you ever read. So in the long tradition of interpreting Don Quixote, you could say that's kind of an opposition too. Some people read it from a romantic perspective, and they cheer Don Quixote. Go Don Quixote, follow your ideals, be a knight, even though you can't. The other side is more realistic. You could say sometimes people call them the neoclassical branch of Don Quixote interpretation. And they pay attention to the fact that during the story, a lot of people get hurt. A lot of people break bones and lose teeth. And they take Cervantes, or at least the narrator, at his word when he tells us at one point that the whole point of his novel is to criticize these ridiculous works of chivalry. Now, they've been around since, well, it depends on where you begin it, but they were flourishing stories about King Arthur and his knights in, I would say, the 1200s, so the 13th century. We are now 400 years after that, but the stories were still told. They were still going strong. And for most people, they were so cliche and so overdone, overwrought, overwritten, and kind of empty, frosting, that they were much derided, especially by the literary elites. So this is what Cervantes says he's up to. He says that he is criticizing the books of chivalry. In fact, he calls his book an invective, right, a diatribe. And the idea is that he would just destroy the genre forever. No one would write another work about chivalric romance. Well, if he attempted to do that, it backfired, if that's what he had in mind. Now, some people think that you're not supposed to take the narrator at his word, or that the narrator, even though Cervantes and his narrator started off wanting to write an invective against chivalry, that Don Quixote and his pal Sancho eventually won them over, and that he was essentially converted. So that is something we won't resolve. I'll leave that to you, our podcast viewers and listeners, to decide.
I was just pointing.
You're pointing at where they live.
Yeah.
I thought
You.
I thought the tape had run out.
Oh,
Okay. The kinds of chivalric story that Cervantes had in mind were kind of a Spanish version of that, and so the most famous knight was not Lancelot or Sir Gawain or Sir Galahad. It was Amadis of Gaul. So as you read Don Quixote, if he ever talks about Amadis, he'll sometimes call him the pole star of knight errantry. English listeners, you might be more familiar with the story of, say, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Do you know that one? Do you remember how the plot starts there?
Oh yeah, I love that story.
Tell them just the bare bones of the beginning scene.
Yeah, so basically, Gawain is part of the Knights of the Round Table, and so he's sitting with King Arthur and the rest of the boys, and so they're just kind of sitting around the table during. Well, I don't know if it's Christmas time at that point.
It's just after Christmas time, right?
It's just after Christmas, so they're sitting there, and it's like a banquet, and everything is just kind of going normally and things like that until Green Knight walks in, this magical being. Should I go any further, or should we? I don't know what I should say.
Go ahead, because it's early in the story, so you don't want to. Tell the cool detail, right? He challenges all the knights to a Christmas game, which he then explains, and he's this giant green knight on this giant green horse. And he rides in
Yeah.
right into the middle of Camelot and challenges all of the greatest, the biggest badasses of the realm to a Christmas game. And it turns out that it is an exchange of axe blows.
Yeah.
Pick it up from there.
Probably should have mentioned that when I said Green Knight, that he's not just like a green painted.
It's not a little tiny knight.
Yeah, he's this magical, like, I mean, I'm not even sure how you describe it, but, I guess the Knights of the Round Table aren't sure either. So when he walks in, he says that, okay, if one of you is brave enough, you get to swing at my head as long as I get to swing at your head with my axe a year later, right?
Yeah.
So that's the deal. So the round table is quiet, which is awesome. And eventually, Gawain, seeing himself, or at least saying that he's the most expendable one, we're not sure.
Right.
But he says he's the most expendable one, and he takes up the challenge. And he takes the axe, and he cuts down the Green Knight like he were a tree.
And I love he lays his head down right on the table. So he has a clean shot. Right?
Yeah. No trickery. He gets a clean shot, right? But then, after his head is clean cut off, and the Green Knight, his body stands up, picks up his head by the hair, and he's just holding his head right here, and he says, "See you guys later. See you in a year." And Gawain, Knights of the Round Table, shocked.
Yeah. That's a great image. I've seen just recently a promo for a movie that's coming out that I think will be out by the time this podcast airs. We're recording in early June, and so the movie's coming out in the summer, I think, but it's called The Green Knight. I'm really looking forward to it. I hope they don't botch it. They usually botch classic literature when they turn it into film, like, for example, Beowulf. I'll complain about that in a future podcast. It's such a great image that he chops his head off, the head rolls, the body goes over, probably feels around for it, finally finds it. Oh, this is green, picks it up and holds it up to Gawain. Oh, sorry. And says, "I'll see you in a year." So the reason I bring it up is just to remind you the kind of, impossible nonsense, but fun that you see or you read about in chivalric romances. If they were all that good, I would probably read them until my brain dried up too. The most important part about it is that Gawain is so noble that he actually keeps his appointment. He actually shows up at the Green Knight's Chapel a year later to take the return axe blow. And he doesn't defend himself. He just lays his head on a stump. So we may come back to that at the end of our podcast. But for the moment, let's go back to Don Quixote and let's look at another quotation that tells us more about why Don Quixote and I should have pointed out, he's not named Don Quixote at the beginning. His name is Alonso Quijano or Quijada or Quesada or Quesana. The narrator tells us that different historical manuscripts that he's looked at disagree about what Don Quixote's original name was. And that's part of the history, or the presentation as history, to make you think that the narrator actually looked into the La Manchan archives to find out about this character. So we'll talk more about that later. But in any case, we want to talk about the reason that Alonso Quijada, whatever his name was, becomes Don Quixote. So let's see, what number do I want to go to?
Are you subscribed yet? Take some time.
Thank you. Awesome commercials while I look.
Like, comment, share, tell other people. Don't be that guy that doesn't get on the trend.
Right.
Do it when it wasn't cool.
Yeah. Definitely. We got to set up a GoFundMe.
Exactly.
Right. All right. So Don Quixote explains to his friend Sancho what he's up to. And this, I think this is the quotation that you came up with independently. So tell me if I'm right. "Friend Sancho, know that I, by heaven's will, have been born in this our iron age to revive it in the age of gold." And you're right. He was just laughing about him at him about something before that, where Don Quixote showed some fear. In this, so I was born in this age of iron to revive in it the age of gold, or the golden as it is called. I am he for whom perils, mighty achievements, and valiant deeds are reserved. This is one of the things that you see in all of these old chivalries, that these knights they're not just heroes that go out, like action figures and defeat bad guys. They are often prophesied, right? In one book, The Quest of the Holy Grail, which I'll talk about for sure in some future podcast, the main knight is Galahad. And you find out that he was prophesied all the way back in Adam and Eve's day. And so when he achieves this and that and the next feat, one after another, you realize that it's all about God's will. So here Don Quixote is tapping into that kind of tradition. So he says, I am, I say again, he who is to revive the Knights of the Round Table, the 12 of France, and the 9 worthies, and he who is to consign to oblivion the Platiers, the Tablantes, the Olivantes, and Tirantes, the Phoebuses and Belianuses, and the whole herd of famous knights errant of days gone by. You say knights errant like attorneys general, of days gone by, performing in these in which I live such exploits, marvels, and feats of arms as shall obscure their brightest deeds. So Don Quixote, a very ambitious man.
Yeah.
I didn't give any of the details that the story does about how he is 50, and apparently the idea is that when you're 50, you're on your way down. So that was funnier back 10 or 20 years ago. But he just doesn't have much going on in his life. He is not married, doesn't have any kids. He does have a niece. You never hear about his siblings, though. And he does have a housekeeper, but he's got very modest means. And there's just nothing so much going on in his life. So he is this kind of archetypal character who decides, maybe like right after his retirement party, that he needs to branch out and do something adventurous. And so this is what he does. He starts off by reading, but then he gets to a point where he just realizes, this is my mission. This is what I have to do.
I am struggling. Yeah, well, not as much as this guy, though.
You're just mad because I just zinged him with an inside joke that nobody else knows about. Here's another
not inside
passage,
anymore.
Another passage where Don Quixote waxes poetic about what he wants to do. Remember in the passage that Sancho here brought to our attention about the Golden Age. He goes on, and at this point, he is talking to some incredulous goat herds. They're out on a mission, and the goat herds have no idea what this dude who's dressed up like a knight is up to, but he explains. He says, happy the age, happy the time to which the ancients gave the name of golden, not because in that fortunate age the gold so coveted in this our iron one was gained without toil, no, but because they that lived in it knew not the two words mine and thine. In that blessed age, all things were in common. So Don Quixote was a communist, or maybe an apostle. He goes on. He says, then all was peace, all friendship, all concord. Then was it that the innocent and fair young shepherdesses roamed from vale to vale and hill to hill with flowing locks, and no more garments than were needful, and modestly to cover what modesty seeks and ever sought to hide.
That's clear.
So don't show so much leg, Butch. Justice held her ground, undisturbed and unassailed by the efforts of favor and of interest, that now so much impair, pervert, and beset her. Maidens in modesty, as I have said, he says it again, wandered at will, alone and unattended, without fear of insult from lawlessness or libertine assault, without fear of and if they were, this is the great line, but if they were undone, it was of their own will and pleasure. It really says that. But now in this hateful age of ours, not one is safe, not though some new labyrinth like that of Crete conceal and surround her. Still talking about the shepherdesses. In defense of these, as time advanced and wickedness increased, the order of knights errant was instituted to defend maidens, to protect widows, and to succor the orphans and the needy. To this order I belong.
Wow. Great work.
Very poetic, isn't it? Very
yes.
Inspiring. That's one of the things that you see, and I keep talking about the oppositions that we're supposedly not talking about today. But there's a kind of formula, and it says that after the speech, the listeners marveled at the lucidity of the madman. So he goes back and forth between being seemingly insane and being not just sane, but wise. And so that's part of the fun. The oppositions crash, and then they switch or they mix together. Let me read just one more about the age of gunpowder. Happy the blessed ages that knew not the dread fury of those devilish engines of artillery, whose inventor, I am persuaded, is in hell receiving the reward of his diabolical invention, by which he made it easy for a base and cowardly arm to take the life of a gallant gentleman, like, for example, himself. And that, when he knows not how or whence, in the height of the ardor and enthusiasm that fire and animate brave hearts, there should come some random bullet, discharged perhaps by one who fled in terror at the flash when he fired off his accursed machine. That is the guy who shoots the noble knight from afar, so scared just by the backfire of his gun, he reveals his cowardly nature, which in an instant puts an end, the bullet that is, an end to the projects and cuts off the life of one who deserved to live for ages to come. And thus, when I reflect on this, I am almost tempted to say that in my heart I repent of having adopted this profession of knight-errant in so detestable an age as we live in now. For though no peril can make me fear, still it gives me some uneasiness to think that powder and lead may rob me of the opportunity of making myself famous and renowned throughout the known world by the might of my arm and the edge of my sword. But heaven's will be done, and if I succeed in my attempt, I shall be all the more honored, as I have faced greater dangers than the knights errant of yore exposed themselves to. We'll come back to that opposition momentarily. Oh, I'm almost out. Oh, juice. Always plug in.
Happens.
Always charge your equipment before you start
Yeah.
a podcast.
Don Quixote did say that.
Right. All right, let's go to the first episode. The first Sally, when Don Quixote, and I'm going to skip a bunch of stuff because I'm going to save it for later, but which is finally a partial explanation why Anthony is wearing that ridiculous hat. When he decides to become knight, the first thing he does is he has to find the things that would make him a knight. And there are many different things, but the most important is his armor. So he happens to have some old heirlooms that are hundreds of years old that have been passed down through the generations, and he dusts them off and puts them on, and he has a helmet. But what he finds out is that the helmet is incomplete, kind of like ours. It doesn't have a visor. So he has to make a visor for himself. We'll come back to that episode in a minute. He also, as a knight, has to have a cool name, so he renames himself, and that's when Alonso Quixote becomes Don Quixote de la Mancha. We'll talk more about that later. He has to find a noble steed, and so he has this broken down old nag, the guy with a back that kind of slumps down like this, so that you can just walk alongside as the horse goes. He calls that steed Rocinante, and we'll explain those names. They're all really important, but if we talk about those, we'll never get far enough into reason and rationalization. He finally manages to convince himself that he's got enough to go out on his first journey. Now, the one thing he does not have is the most important ingredient of a knight, which is?
I know this one. No, I'm just kidding. A maiden.
Exactly. A squire. Oh, actually a maiden. I take it back. That you actually gave me the right answer. That was the better answer to my question. I forgot to mention it. He needs his armor, he needs his name, he needs his horse, but he also needs a maiden. So thank you. Yeah. Correct me.
Loosely clothed.
So modestly.
And not one that he knows.
So we'll probably devote a whole podcast to this woman whom he names Dulcinea. So he's got all that, but the one thing that he's missing, the one thing that we really need if we have all of that is the next ingredient, a squire, a sidekick, right? So that's the second best answer, but the one I was looking for. He doesn't have Sancho Panza yet, so he goes off on his first expedition. Very, very sad. Don't lose your head. And what happens is that he's riding along, and what does he happen upon? But he happens upon an inn. So this is what happens, and this gives you an idea of the way in which Don Quixote pulls off his fantasy. So, as he's riding down the road on Rocinante, he sees an inn. And Ormsby says, at the door were standing two young women, girls of the district, as they called them. That is, less than modest girls. On their way to Seville with some carriers who had chanced to halt that night at the inn. And as happened what might to our adventurer, everything he saw or imagined seemed to him to be and to happen after the fashion of what he read of. The moment he saw the inn, he pictured it to himself as a castle, with 4 turrets and pinnacles of shining silver, not forgetting the drawbridge and moat and all the belongings usually ascribed to castles of the sort. So I love that phrase. He pictured it to himself. very philosophical, I would say. So what we see here is the MO of Don Quixote. He sees the real world, but he translates it into something else. He transforms it into something else. And in this way, he is really chivalric. Now, the way I put it, at least with my hand gestures, didn't really work. It's not that he sees one thing and translates it into something else so much as that he sees one thing and translates it into something else. So for people just listening on audio, at first what I was doing is moving laterally, going from the left to the right. Really what he's doing is he's going up. He's going higher, right? He's transforming what he sees into a higher reality. Now, the thing that drives this point home, or there's a passage that drives this home really well. It was first pointed out to me by an old teaching friend of mine, Sal Alasso from the University of California at Davis. So Sal, if you're out there, I am still using your stuff and I am still remembering to credit you because it's really, really good. So thanks again, Sal. But there's a book called The Medieval Mind by a man named W.T. Jones. And I've only ever read this one page from it, but it's in the introduction. And what he's doing is discussing the outlook, the worldview of medieval men, and emphasizing that their thinking was strictly defined by what they saw as not just truths, but transcendental truths, truths that went above our experience that we could apprehend through our reason, but even went beyond our rational analysis. So here is a quotation from W.T. Jones. He's the author. Sal Lasso is the teacher who directed me to him. Here is the first, two paragraphs, or rather it's 2 paragraphs from this introduction to the medieval mind. Perhaps the principal element of this worldview was its sacramental outlook. What made Augustine, Aquinas, and other medieval thinkers so fundamentally alike was this outlook they shared. What distinguishes the modern mind so sharply from the medieval mind is that modern men have largely lost that outlook and now share the basically secular point of view of the Greeks. To say that medieval men looked on this world as a sacrament means, first, that they conceived this world to be but the visible sign of an invisible reality, a world thoroughly impregnated with the energy, purpose, and love of its creator. And by its creator, we mean the Christian God, right? So this is a Christian phenomenon in a Christian world, right? So capital C, creator. The love of its creator who dwells in it, in this world, as he dwells in the bread and wine on the altar. So we're talking about, what's the sacrament called?
Oh, the
bread
Eucharist,
and the wine.
Yeah, Eucharist.
The Eucharist goes back to the Gospels, right? And in the Last Supper, Jesus picks up bread and holds it to his disciples and said, "This is my body that will be given up for you." And then he holds up a cup of wine and says, "This is my blood will be given up for you." Very weird thing to say, especially to a bunch of Jews who are not likely to want to eat the blood of a mammal, much less a person. So the idea, at least in the Catholic tradition, and of course Cervantes and Don Quixote, or in the Catholic tradition, the idea is that the bread, in some real sense, a spiritual sense, not a scientific sense, not a material sense, but in a very real spiritual sense, the bread becomes the body of Christ, and the wine becomes the blood of Christ. So this is what the sacramental outlook is about. That is a sacrament. It is a making holy of something, of making bread and mere wine into the body and blood of their Savior Jesus. So that's the kind of center of the sacramental outlook. So that was the first point. This world is the visible sign of an invisible reality. Well, the second point is a consequence of that. So back to Jones. Second, it means that medieval men conceived of this world as a sacrifice to be freely and gratefully dedicated to the all-true, all-giver. So that's exactly what you see with Gawain and the Green Knight. The reason that he's willing to stand up and fight the Green Knight, to accept his Christmas challenge, and then willing to follow him a year later and finish the game. Even though, as far as I can tell, the Green Knight really cheated. That's about the falsest premise you can play a game on. But you chop my head off and I won't die, but another podcast. Anyway, he does it because he's serving God. It's a very religious text. and Gawain is constantly reminding himself of that as he travels looking for the Green Knight. The Green Knight, incidentally, doesn't even tell him where he lives. You have to find me in a year, so go on a journey.
Yeah.
So back to Jones. Thus, because this world should be sacrificed to the next world, to God, whereas for us and for the Greeks, the world by and large means just what it seems to be. That is for us moderns, as opposed to the medievals. By contrast, for men of the Middle Ages, it meant something beyond itself and immensely better. Now, whereas for us and the Greeks, life on earth is its own end, for medieval man, life's true end was beyond this world. You can see how this is exactly what makes Don Quixote tick. Now, Jones goes on and says, it can hardly be denied that this sacramental point of view was a block to progress. Progress in knowledge of how to control the environment and utilize it for this worldly purposes. To many, it seems equally obvious, now that this viewpoint has disappeared, that men have rid themselves of much that was a liability, ignorance, superstition, and intolerance. What is not so obvious, says Jones, is that the modern world has also lost something of value. If the sacramental outlook of the Middle Ages manifested itself here and there in what a modern clinician would describe as acute psychopathology, it also manifested itself in serenity and confidence and a sense of purpose, meaningfulness and fulfillment, qualities that the modern clinician looks for in vain among his contemporaries. Mm-hmm. So, beautiful couple of paragraphs, and to me it seems to hit Don Quixote on the head, right? Like this. I've been waiting to do that. So,
oh, you think you can just move on?
I'll just put the spoon over here.
Yeah, damn right.
So
it didn't come anywhere near me. Just like on that. That's the reason it didn't. Yeah,
we're gonna dub in a sound that makes it sound.
If it had hit my head, the spoon would have been bent.
So now here's the thing. All that so far makes it sound just like a fairy tale. Makes it sound just like a children's kind of romance or fable. Charming, boyish, maybe winning in that way, but not especially psychologically profound. And with no real edge to it, right? It's just an idealistic guy doing idealistic things. But there's more to it, because we're told over and over again, as he did in the passage I read about how his brain dried up and he lost his wits, that Don Quixote is not just idealistic, he's nuts. He's insane. And this is where another ingredient comes into play, and finally we get there. Do you want to do it to me?
A knight does not indulge in such revenge
on his lessers.
We are knights of the rueful countenance. We have standards here.
So what you're saying is that a knight would never condescend to whoop a nurse.
Yes.
So rationalization, that's the ingredient that we haven't gotten to. So this, it seems to me, is the genius, undefeatable, skeptical move of the novel. And this is where it gets really funny. You remember that I told you how when Don Quixote was trying to put his armor together, that he had a piece of armor kind of like ours, although these are actually not supposed to be imitations of that. They're supposed to be helmets of Mambrino, which we'll get to later. But it works for this too. So he finds a helmet, but it's missing a piece. It's missing a visor, or I guess they call it a sallet, that you can pull down when you're fighting. Right, it's up here like glasses, your sunglasses, and you pull it down when you go into battle. So what does he do about this? Let's read it. So he says he finds a helmet, but it's in pieces. So Ormsby picks it up. This deficiency, however, his ingenuity supplied, for he contrived a kind of half-helmet of pasteboard, which fitted onto the morion, looked like a hole. So basically he added the visor. It is true that, in order to see if it was strong and fit to stand a cut, he drew his sword and gave it a couple of slashes. First of which undid in an instant what had taken him a week to do. The ease with which he had knocked it to pieces disconcerted him somewhat, and to guard against that danger, he set to work again, fixing bars of iron on the inside until he was satisfied with its strength. And then, not caring to try any more experiments with it, he passed it and adopted it as a helmet of the most perfect construction. So, that is our first example of rationalization, right?
Yeah.
Now, it seems to me that when I teach this book in class, or when I just teach rationalization in any class, because rationalization is at the center of all sorts of books, especially the great books, all through Shakespeare. It's what helps you get down deep into a person. I ask students what rationalization means, and some of them seem at a loss, and they just say, well, probably just reasoning, using your brain, rationalizing, right? Well, that's partly what it means. That's usually the first definition you see in the dictionary, but it also means something more. So are you familiar with the second meaning of rationalization?
Yeah, let me see if I can give it a go. So it's like, maybe this is like a little too harsh, but how about twisting what is like clearly evidence to fit like your worldview or something like that?
Perfect.
So,
yeah. No,
cool.
that's perfect. Yeah.
Awesome.
It's the suffix "eyes." Apparently, I should have looked it up, but it means like to make into or to make appear as. At least that's how the word, or that helps you understand the word. It's not that you are behaving rationally. It's not that you are being rational, or that your thoughts are rational. It's that you are rationalizing them, right? You are making them seem as if they were reasonable, because at some point you know darn well that they're not. So, as you said, it's when you said you might be a little harsh. Well, I was going to go harsher. I'd say it's essentially lying to yourself. There's a truth that you do not like. For example, this paper mache visor that I just made is not a real visor, and it will not protect me if I get into a fight with somebody using iron. So what does Don Quixote do? He rationalizes. He says, I put in some lead reinforcements. It looks good. It's going to work. I don't need to test it. Or he lies to himself and pretends that he thinks it's going to work. This is the real fun of Don Quixote. And this, you could say, is the recurrent dynamic in the story. He sees something, and he doesn't just transmute it into something greater or more magical, because the magical, it seems to me, stands in for the transcendent. He knows that he's fibbing to himself. And he also lies to himself repeatedly in order to make things work. So, at this point, I think we should go windmills. Full windmill. The most famous episode in all of Don Quixote. Although, before that, I see that we are at least an hour in, right? Mm-hmm. What do you think? Should we take a break now, or should we keep going?
Sure, let's take a break.
All right. We'll be back. Fade to black. And we'll start in another minute.
Cool.
Awesome, dude.
Well,